The function of romantic relationships in video games often takes the role of another check to be marked on a list of things to do in a game space, a conquest of another within that simulational power fantasy context. In something like Atlus's Persona 4, it's a way to further accumulate statistical advantage for the player self through upgrades and special bonuses, the women that you date in those games, and the men that you befriend in the same format, functionally the same as finding items in chests to be taken back as possessions in pursuit of more power. Even without these direct mechanical reward associations, romance is still often treated as something to be attained as if it's an object. BioWare's literature like Star Wars Knights of the Old Republic comes to mind, the relationships being totally perfunctory outside of an expression of player ownership over the work and characters. Simulated relationship is part of the escapist fabric. The idea on its own is something to be explored in greater detail at a later date, the concept of characters existing only as tokens to be gained for the player's own satisfaction, but for now it is only necessary to be understood as a foundation for this text. This is how most video games approach romance. It is something to be performed to validate the player. If it is not, then it is often something almost completely exterior to the player. In Final Fantasy IV, Cecil and Rosa are lovers, but the player has no say in how their relationship is performed. They act out their parts on the grand stage of the 16-bit world, and the player characterizes them in unique ways through the act of play, but ultimately they will always feel the same way about each other that they are scripted to do. They say the same things to each other and do the same things for each other regardless. These are the two ways that romance is typically presented in the video game, either as an unquestioned constant of the background, or as something to be fought for and won like a score to be earned. There are, however, other expressions that are less known. Final Fantasy VII, for instance, obfuscates its romance entirely, it not something to be earned, but something that can happen naturally through the choices that are made. The game gives one no knowledge that how the player chooses to characterize Cloud Strife, its main protagonist, will determine who the player goes on a date with at the amusement park toward the end of the game's first disc, but it is still an element that exists ambiently outside of their epistemic purview. It's less of a conquest over a trinket to be won and more a happy truth that two people find together if certain choices are made, just as love so often is. With meta-knowledge it becomes a conquest, but Final Fantasy VII as a text itself does not make it clear that this is even possible, as much as the zeitgeist likes to push that it's a game with a heavy focus on its love triangle. Regardless, its sequel would also do interesting and distinct things with the framework established in this text, as the ever-shifting Final Fantasy is wont to do. Final Fantasy VIII is a unique entry in the Final Fantasy series for a multitude of reasons, even beyond how distinct those games can be between entries. It eschews almost every convention of their design philosophy, retaining only truly the active time battle system and the general functions of overworld play. However, one of its largest departures is that, as opposed to Final Fantasy IV and Final Fantasy VII, which featured romance as an element of their storytelling that, while important as any element is, was far from the most essential focus, Final Fantasy VIII itself centers on a love narrative. The text follows the characters Squall and Rinoa as they try to find hope in the time-compressed postmodern landscape where all prior absolute truths have dissolved into the universal ash. Their romance is the main, although not exclusive, means that Squall comes out of his shell, him growing to trust and have belief in things beyond himself through the love that the two of them share, in spite of the wasteland in front of him. In turn, the player learns this as well by performing the relationship actively through choosing the dialogue options and responses that Squall has to Rinoa's actions. This has, in the near 30 years since the game was released, become one of the most common criticisms against how the game plays out. Why can one choose to characterize Squall as a repugnant jerk if Rinoa still decides to be with him by the end of the game? To some, that's a form of incorrigible friction with the text. However, without that ability to choose, then Final Fantasy VIII would simply fall apart. If you, the viewer, are one of these people who believe this and think that watching through my argumentation isn't worth your time, then you can just skip to the timestamp on the screen in order to get the point given to you in full. For those who are willing to listen and experience the text, however, Squall and Renoa's relationship hinges on the player self, that is, Squall, being able to choose dialogue options because it puts Squall's character development in the active hands of the player, and thus the player is forced to grow alongside him and consider their connections as well. The player in any given video game changes alongside the player avatar and the two meld into each other. This phenomena is one that I choose to describe as player self in my literature. The idea that there is an entity that is a fusion of an individual's mode of play and the way the player avatar is characterized within the text itself. For example, the main character of 1986's The Legend of Zelda, named Link by the game's opening crawl but otherwise has no signifier, will always be a small, pointy-eared, brown-haired individual wearing a tunic. These elements of how this character are characterized are static, but the player influences almost all the other aspects of their expression. What preferences this character might have, the way they talk to the various other characters they meet in the world on account of them not explicitly speaking despite the implication of speech, even their gender, which I have omitted despite there being a commonly held interpretation based on paratextual sources, is not explicitly characterized within the text. Further elaboration on those elements are included in a companion piece to the text, the instruction manual, but even that does not nearly account for all of what was mentioned. While not the purest expression of a player avatar, that would go to something along the lines of the main character of the Colossal Cave Adventure from a decade prior, who is almost entirely imagined due to its framework of a text-based adventure game, although even then one must assume that they are someone who is human and generally in possession of their full faculties. It is a useful one for this particular rhetorical explanation. This same principle can then be applied to Squall in Final Fantasy VIII. Squall is a fairly defined character, at least compared to someone like Link. He has his own dialogue, though often his dialogue is left up to interpretation through implied dialogue with non-player characters, as is the tradition of Japanese role-playing games, and he has distinct animations. Despite this, the player can choose what he prioritizes, how he moves through the spaces and the junctions that he brings with him into battle. How much does he focus on the completely optional playing card game? What stats does Squall choose to use when building himself as a combatant? These choices are all aspects of the unified entity that is player self that are determined by the player themselves in that transaction that makes up every video game. The most striking of these choices that the player makes, however, are the dialogue options presented throughout the game. This was nothing new to Final Fantasy conceptually. Dialogue options determined much of how the player defined Cloud in Final Fantasy VII as well, as explored briefly earlier. However, as opposed to Final Fantasy VII's expression of these dialogue options, Final Fantasy VIII gives them far less weight mechanically. There is no explicit dating sequence that only happens depending on how Squall behaves as the avatar of the player. Squall and Renoa fall in love regardless, and the game's events play out roughly the same. One may decry this as one's choices not mattering because they are not validated by the clockwork of the diegesis, but in a sense, they then matter more without that tangible factor. They are yours, without any reward for them being chosen influencing that decision. The player isn't motivated by a secret stat bonus that they can get if they're nice or mean to the party member Zell, and so the player's choice of either of those options is more revealing of their character and their individual disposition and characterizes their player self differently. This then bleeds into the core romance of Final Fantasy VIII, its main narrative throughline. In order for Squall to truly grow out of his shell as the player self of the work, the player must do the work alongside him, for no satisfaction and with nothing to gain other than itself. Squall ends up Renoa's boyfriend regardless of how the text unfolds. To first investigate this, it is best examined using a complex example of how the two of them interact from the game's events. In Final Fantasy VIII, Squall lives in a dormitory at a military academy where a significant portion of the game is set, and though Renoa has been to the location before because of a previous romantic entanglement, she does not have the opportunity to explore it until an optional interaction some ways into the game during a brief moment of calm. Squall takes her on a guided tour of the dormitory, and the two of them share moments of quiet beauty together in spite of Squall's reluctance. However, this is all assuming that the player makes the decisions that allow this interaction to play out in the first place. Squall has the ability to refuse Renoa's request for a tour of the space, and so the sequence does not happen. And if Renoa is chosen to accompany another character earlier in the game, she won't even be present to present this choice to him. This sequence does not affect anything in the game in a direct mechanical sense. Squall comes around eventually to Renoa regardless of what choice is made. The moments themselves are their own reward, though, and a relationship is not only its culmination. By performing the role of a good boyfriend and partner to Renoa throughout the work, the player is rewarded not through material strength within the text or with Renoa as an object to be obtained, but instead with the joy of choosing love and belief itself. Squall's growth can only be satisfying if the player chooses to grow alongside him, and so that is why the choice's existence is important in the work, even if it might seem obvious. This is made even more apparent when one realizes that this particular choice is one of the more bespoke ones in the text. In the aforementioned sequence, an entire full-motion video plays out that doesn't play out otherwise. These FMVs are a significant part of the game's pacing and weight. So in a sense, that is its own form of reward, even if it is not a mechanical one. Most of the choices regarding how to treat Renoa, however, do not have that same reward attached to them. Whether or not one is kind to Renoa in a choice at a radio station in response to her admittedly quite childish demeanor amongst revolutionary outfits, or indulges her with kindness on a date at a festival that she urges Squall to go on, doesn't have any tangible effect on the sequence of events that follow. No reward for the player, even in the form of an additional cutscene besides a more coherent and harmonious relationship resultant from these reluctant forays into the forbidding new. Without the choice to grow alongside Squall, the growth itself might as well not exist, and that choice is made more meaningful for the fact that it is made for the choice of love itself. We are forced to become more outgoing and self-sacrificing with him, vulnerable souls born from the callous and self-serving player entity. When Squall decides to give everything up to save Renoa from space, even if it costs him his life, it is only meaningful because the player made the choice to grow alongside him. If one doesn't, then there will be a dissonance. So, the common criticism of Final Fantasy VIII falls short in the face of its structure. It doesn't matter if Squall and Renoa are bound by the game text to always end up together at the end of the work, regardless of the player's unwillingness to make sure that they do. The reason the choice matters is because it has to be the player's. If you do not choose to believe in the magic trick, to see the main character grow before your eyes and learn to love by his side, then you cannot understand Final Fantasy VIII's general thrust. If you skipped the body of the video simply to hear this point, seeing conclusions is the only purpose of a narrative, then both Final Fantasy VIII and this video were lost on you. A relationship is more than just the act of its creation, just like anything else. It is the rhythm of its existence, and this is examined very well through the ludic engagement that the player has in constructing how Squall and Renoa's relationship operates. You can skip to the end of a work if you want to hear its points. You can date someone just to say you dated someone as an act of ownership over them as a semiotic. But whether or not those things have any meaning isn't in their final conclusion, it's in everything that they are. To ignore that is to ignore life itself, reality built in with a foregone conclusion, and to not grow where Squall has grown throughout the course of Final Fantasy VIII. One must believe to be believed in, and love to be loved, and one cannot extract meaning from Final Fantasy VIII if they don't choose to go with it on its tour.